really found that similar to the way that an ecosystem is made up of many parts, trying to pin down what's really causing this issue for the bats led us in many different directions to different people who do different things.
So I'm an environmental education specialist here at the park. Basically, that means that I'm a teacher, but instead of working in a classroom, I get to work here at the park. I do a lot of environmental education programs and recreational programs for the public, for school-age kids, for families that are out here camping with us. So I do programs about the species of animals that live in the woods, and then also the species of animals that live in our lake.
Well, I started working with bats initially in 2007 is when I became rabies vaccinated. So in 2007 and 2008 I was living in California. Somebody that is a wonderful friend of mine became the sole reason why I do rehab now. She said, hey, you'd be great at volunteering with a wildlife rehabilitator. And in San Diego, they have a huge diversity of wildlife. I started doing songbird rehabilitation, like volunteer. And then I worked my way up to shorebirds and birds of prey and other species. And I saw this name for bats, which was the only species that they didn't take. We had foxes, coyotes, and other rabies vectors, but not bats. And I was like, why don't we have bats? But it really started when I was 7, and my grandmother and grandfather owned a 1700s manor, and maternity roosts would always come, and they were tricolored pipistrelles, and they would come and roost there in the summer. I never saw bats before, except for that moment every year. And it became a memory, now that I look back on it, a great memory. We'd sit on the porch and watch the bats fly around eating insects, and it was like a family event. And then a few years ago I moved back to Pennsylvania, about 7 years ago, and then I started volunteering at another wildlife rescue center called Ark Wildlife Education and Rehabilitation Center. I started the rescue in hopes that it would interest people and we'd gain supporters and help educate the public, of course. That's a huge one. So this is a 2-car garage that we converted into what is the bat clinic. So this is where we treat a lot of the bats. If I do suspect anything that could potentially be spread from one bat to another, they will be quarantined in a different location. But for the most part, they're all in here. I'm like a fledgling little bird. I'm getting my wings and learning how to fly on my own. So eventually, hopefully soon, we'll be permitted on our own and taking flight by ourselves.
When I was young, I've always grown up loving wildlife and animals and wanting to help them and save them and finding baby bunnies. So as an adult, I decided to investigate and look more into it. And my first experience was having a baby robin that I raised and did totally the wrong things with. And the poor bird flew into my neighbor's yard and got killed by their dog. So that really made me want to learn more and do things the right way. And at about the same time, there was a local group getting together for wildlife rehabilitation called York Wild Care. So that was in about 1986, and I became involved with that group from the foundations when it started. So my first part that I became more active in was with the songbird group. We divided into 3 sections: the songbirds, the raptors, which are birds of prey, and then mammals. And I really went to the songbirds because of my experience. One day I found a bat in my backyard on the ground, and I asked the mammal people who were active at that time who knew what to do with it, and no one knew what to do, and most people were freaked out and didn't want to do anything with it. So I investigated and looked up research on what you did with bats and took care of it. And that was my beginnings with knowing what to do and how to do it. And I wasn't really afraid or freaked out by them because I just thought they were very interesting. I've always liked snakes, I've always liked reptiles, and to me bats fall into that category of unappreciated creatures. So I began to take care of this bat and learn what to do, and then when other bats came into the group, people sent them to me. So that's how I became the person who was the one to go to with bat situations.
So the mission of the office is to cultivate an ethos of ecological citizenship on campus and in the community, with a focus on sustainability planning, education, and the ultimate goal is to create an ecologically and socially just world. And so we see campus as a really great opportunity to do that. We work with our college facilities office, we work with operations, with students, and our primary objective is really about creating a campus culture and a campus community that values our ecological systems and really sees us as a part of our ecological community, and sees ourselves as citizens, which requires action and requires valuing, right? Just like you value other people, it requires valuing other species and plant biodiversity and things like that. So the office really does a lot around education, advocacy, and sustainability planning on campus to try to make the operations of the college campus as environmentally friendly and socially just as possible.
So let's start at the beginning. What is this white-nosed bat syndrome? And why is it wreaking so much havoc among the bat communities?
You know, between 95-98% of our little brown bat populations are gone. They don't exist.
Yes, when I first heard about it, it was unknown what it was or what it was going to do and where it came from, and there was so many unknowns about it. What they did know is that there were populations of bats outside of caves being found on the ground dead, and they didn't know why. And then they started to find this white kind of fungus on the bats' noses area. So it just became more and more of a investigative, finding out things and trying to figure out what's going on.
So white nose syndrome, the fungus was introduced to the United States. It was introduced to New York State in the mid-2000s by people that like to travel and go caving. And so when you go down into caves, of course, you have specialized equipment, shoes, dress, that kind of thing. And those people were not cleaning or decontaminating their equipment between visits. And so somehow this fungus, which is present in Europe, and it was brought over to the United States by people that go caving. Of course, they spread that fungus from their gear into cave environments in New York State. And then our bats, of course, just kind of picked it up in New York State because of the migratory habits of some of our bat species. So white nose syndrome survives in cold-loving areas. So it is in caves, cold caves, where the temperatures are always between just above freezing up into the low 50s. And so it affected the bat populations that were hibernating in those areas. And it's present in the soils now and in the rocks and in the crevices in those caves. The fungus basically causes the bat to be irritated, makes its skin and its wings and its fur itchy while they're hibernating. And so the bats wake up more frequently during hibernation, which depletes their fat sources, fat reserves, thus causing them to go try to look for food during the winter months. And of course, our bats here in Pennsylvania eat insects. There's not many insects, if any, insects out in the wintertime. So we're having these bats die off because they are not fully hibernating. They're not staying in a state of hibernation.
A bat that is disturbed in the winter, regardless of white nose syndrome, is really at a high risk of dehydration and emaciation. Because they're dehydrated, there's no water that's plentiful in the winter. They don't drink water the same way other animals do. There's obviously no food, there's no insects for them to eat, so they starve to death. And then you add white nose syndrome on top of that, and it's a storm of effects.
And in the past, I don't know, maybe 3-4 years, I've seen a drastic decline in phone calls and people needing help and assistance, and even looking out in my own skies around my house where we used to see many bats. I see there's a definite decline in the numbers, and I know this has to be related to white nose syndrome that's really wiping out the populations of bats in our area.
It's really devastating to see how this beautiful creature that you see flying around when you're growing up is now almost extirpated or extinct in Pennsylvania.
It's a very concerning thing because even if they do find a cure or figure out what's going on, they're worried that the populations will be so decimated that they can't come back.
But in all this despair, we were able to find one small glimmer of hope.
But what's interesting is that the countries in Europe where this fungus exists, it has existed there alongside the bats. So Europe at some point probably had a bat die-off, but over the years, those bat populations have adapted to learn how to survive and deal with this fungus being present in the environments in which they live.
Okay, so by this point, we've figured out, and you probably have too, that this is really bad. But why do bats really matter? Why is there really so much at stake here?
The most important thing is that they eat so many pest kinds of insects. If you're talking about bats in other countries where they're much larger, they do important things like pollinate. And some people here think we have these large bats, but we don't. Our bats are all the smaller type bats. But they do an important thing by eating mostly mosquitoes, also some other things like moths and beetles and things that farmers appreciate that they do as far as natural pest control goes. With eating mosquitoes, we know that they transmit the West Nile virus and other diseases that people do not want to get. So that's a very important thing that they do.
So if you think about your most common bat in Pennsylvania being the big brown, eating as many insects as they do, and those insects are some of the deadliest animals, I guess you could say, in the world. The mosquito being the deadliest animal in the world. So small, but that is like an appetizer for our night flying protectors. I think that is a huge deal. I mean, disease. The bats control the insect population. They are a keystone species. They control everything as far as insects are concerned. I mean, birds eat insects, but they also eat other things as well. But bats only eat insects, and they're eating hundreds and thousands a night per one bat. So you think about that, and I think about disease spreading.
So little brown bats eat thousands of mosquitoes every night. So if we've lost these bats, of course, we're going to see an increase in mosquito populations. I definitely think I've noticed an increase of mosquito populations.
At this point, we were feeling really pretty discouraged. But the bats aren't necessarily alone in this fight. The Pennsylvania Game Commission and Bucknell University have been researching and looking for solutions to white nose syndrome. But it proves to be a larger battle than they may have initially thought.
The fungus is actually really similar to the type of fungus that creates athlete's foot on humans. So is it treatable on a bat? Yes, there's actually been some research done where bats that have been affected, they've used just antifungal type chemicals on these bats, and they've survived. The fungus is in the environment, and so you can't just clean it all out of the soils. You can't clean it out of all of the rocks. So I feel like the research to come is going to be really interesting to see exactly, how we may be able to help bat populations rebound and hopefully prevent the spread of the fungus to areas that it's not currently in.
There are some national organizations that are specifically geared towards researching and trying to find a solution to white nose syndrome for these bats. But not enough, it seems.
So there's Bat Conservation International, BCI, who I've followed, and Merlin Tuttle was their founder, and he's retired, but he's done so much with research and investigation for many things. So his group began looking into it, and then there's other places that are really looking at this and trying to figure out what's going on. So I think there is an emphasis on trying to find out what's going on, but it's not as popular as like probably saving the rhinos. People are still needing to learn why bats are important.
We all know that humans will always have an effect on the environment around us. So that led us to ask probably one of the hard questions. What are we doing to further hurt this already fragile species?
The other things that humans do is releasing their cats and allowing them to be outdoors. That's a big one, unfortunately. Wind turbines is a huge one. The other is deforestation of old growth forests. So that doesn't just affect the foliage roosting species, that also affects some crevice dwelling species, because their natural behavior during the breeding season is to meet up in old growth forests, copulate, and then go to their hibernation roost.
So number one, awareness, and telling the right people that there's a colony, and knowing that if somebody's going to come in and want to try to get rid of them, what they should do, that they're protected and not just wiped out. You never want to seal things up June, July, and August when the babies are still growing and learning and they live there. You want to wait until everything's done in the fall. There's a lot of things people can do and look into to make sure that the populations we have are preserved. And education is key to all that, for sure.
So after all of this, we were really left wondering, what can we do now? Is there anything we can do now? Or is this irreversible?
The biggest thing that people can do is avoid caves and mines, and just allow the bats to be in their natural habitat undisturbed. Education is huge. Just educating each other on what to do if you find a bat in the middle of summer versus winter, how to handle it properly. You can install bat houses. That's a huge one. A lot of people get discouraged in the first year because they might not have bats in their house. It could be the location or the placement or even the integrity of the bat house itself. So bats are very particular. They're not like birds. They're not just going to seek out something and then be like, oh, this is okay. I can modify it and change it. Bats don't modify their environment. They don't build nests. They don't chew wires. So their house has to be perfect. And to find that perfection is a little difficult. So I encourage people not to be discouraged, but contact us or research a little bit and see what could be changed. Just stop encroachment, stop developing. That's a big one. And I don't know if that'll ever change, unfortunately, but that's huge. That's a big deal. A lot of the lands that we're disturbing and cutting down are inhabitants for other species, and that's also a feeding ground for bats. A lot of bats feed in forested areas, not just in agricultural areas.
This issue of bats and the white nose syndrome really led us to thoughts about our larger responsibilities as humans to take care of this planet that we share.
Yeah, I mean, environmental issues are one of those tricky subjects that it's been so politicized and to an extent ostracized. I mean, sustainability has kind of brought the idea of environmental issues to larger public discourse, right? And so we're talking about it a little bit more in the lens of sustainability, because when we talk about sustainability, we're talking about the environment, the economy, and we're talking about social justice. And so it's a pretty broad umbrella that I think people are a little bit more comfortable with compared to what it was 20, 30, 40 years ago when it was just environmentalists or environmentalism. But that environmentalism still has a foothold in public discourse and the perception of tree hugger or Birkenstock wearer or whatever it might be. Or it's seen as anti-development. And I think that's the biggest one. If it's anti-development, environmentalism and any kind of environmental protection is anti-development. And I don't think it's anti-development as much as it is thinking critically about development. Can we ensure that we protect species and try to ensure that the quality of life of the country, the community, the state, whatever it might be, is cared for, right? And so I think we want to frame the conversation not as being anti-growth, but pro-quality of life. And sometimes that quality of life does require limits. And so trying to have conversations with people about that is extremely important and challenging, because if it means that I have to limit something that I'm doing, or I can't build my house where I want to build it, then there's tension that happens. The best thing that we can do is, I think, listen to each other, educate ourselves. But sometimes even that doesn't necessarily solve the problem. And so that's where we need quality environmental policy and environmental law that protects people first and foremost, but also, in addition to that, protects species. And so we're really working to have conversations around environmental policy, environmental degradation, and the importance of policy that really has its roots in values. What do we value as a society? And my hope is that we can value a quality of life for everyone. We all have a responsibility to participate in creation care, and to have a land ethic that values species and values plant life and values people and our connection to those things.
So by now, you've heard a lot. And yeah, it's a lot to digest. And we think to really and truly understand the severity of this issue, all of us have to understand what a world without bats might look like.
If you don't have this little brown bat population, you're going to have more nuisance insects like mosquitoes, or just insects in general. Bats eat thousands of insects in the evenings, and those insects could be pests, not just for humans, but they could be pests for agricultural crops. And so we, all of us, could start seeing farmers being affected by agricultural insect pests that were being kept under control by bat populations. And if we have agricultural crops not surviving, then those farmers are going to have to raise prices on those foods, which are foods that all of us eat all of the time. So I feel like, losing anything is really going to affect the habitat and ecosystems where those animals live. But losing bats, as an example, it has far-reaching concerns and issues that we as humans we're going to see the effects, and we're going to feel the effects.
So a world without bats it's a little scary. I don't think humans would survive very long without bats, being that they help eradicate the propensity of a disease or virus of any sort. So it's a scary situation.
I look at everything part of our ecosystem in a chain. Even, I tell people this and they think I'm crazy, but even roaches have a place in our world of what they do, what their purpose is. So when you're talking about Pennsylvania, we have native species that are supposed to be here because they do something. If they're wiped out and they can't do it, what then is going to take care of that situation? I would think that the world without fill in the blank of whatever animal you pick is definitely a different world.
So what does this all mean? Maybe we need to get partisanship out of environmental policy. Maybe we need to be smarter about development and deforestation. And maybe all of that starts with simply being better neighbors to the hundreds of thousands of amazing animals and plants that we share our one beautiful planet with. So after all of this, do you think we can afford to lose bats forever?